particular assignment, I'm kind of focusing more on young queer individuals, just because my degree focuses on like grades K through 12. So definitely kind of trying to get more of a youth perspective in terms of issues that they encounter. But I think it's, you know, relevant to talk about anything queer related, because I think the interesting thing is that what, you know, young people experience, you know, what they experience now may be relevant in the future, or what maybe you have to say could be relevant to a young child who is, you know, getting to a point to where they might experience something that you've experienced. So I'm reaching out to people regardless of, you know, if they're 18 years old or 50 years old, whatever, just trying to get like a range of perspectives that I can then combine in research and propose and stuff like that. So that's why I have reached out to you. I have seen your art just online, and a couple of my questions kind of dive deeper into that, just because I think it's necessary to understand your creative process and kind of your background leading into this discussion. But with my background being in art, I felt like it was also a great segue to sort of research the queer community, but kind of tie in that art aspect, because art is very significant in culture, and especially queer culture. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit, or I'm going to kind of question you about that in just a little bit. And I think when we create, there's a lot of sort of storytelling or documentation that goes into that applies to queer culture. So I just really quickly, I just kind of want to get to know you. That way, you know, anybody that watches this gets an understanding of who you are, and we'll kind of go from there. So you can just give me any kind of general information that you think would be relevant, and then we'll jump into the more specifics.
Okay, so my name is David Conrad. I have a BFA in fine art with the concentration in 2D. So most of my work has been in painting. My regular job, as it were, is in a data center doing just technology kind of stuff. And I live in Louisville, Kentucky.
Are you from Louisville, or did something bring you to Louisville?
I grew up here. I was born in Lexington, and yeah. So also I identify as a gay man.
Yay! Awesome. Well, so I kind of want to jump into, again, the whole purpose of interviewing you is to kind of getting that art aspect intertwined with queer culture. So kind of, if you don't mind, describe to me what your creative process looks like. What inspiration do you draw from? What subject matter? Just that general idea of, if I was to see your art, you know, I would have this foundation of knowledge going into it. And sort of, how does your background, whether it's educational, your heritage, your professionalism, how does that affect your creative process and the product that comes from that?
Well, my creative process is, it's hard to define, but in general, I mean, it starts from inspiration, and which can come from anywhere, and it can be like a weird looking building that's about to be torn down, or it can be something I see on social media, a variety of things. It can be just when I'm kind of daydreaming and a random idea comes to me, um, with a new idea of using a certain kind of material or a certain color. Um, and, sometimes it'll be um, looking at art magazines and other artists' work. Um, so my inspiration is sort of all over the place. And um, what I found out um, maybe 5 or 6 years ago that I have attention deficit disorder,
Mhm.
and never knew that, um, and learning that, my brain is just not focused as maybe the rest of the population, or I don't know what the statistics are, but anyway, so, that's just an example, like trailing off. And um, then, so my creative process is kind of assessing all of these ideas that I just mentioned that may come to me at any random time, and deciding which one is pushing me the hardest or weighing on me the most, and going with it. And um, as far as my recent paintings, um, I think of what materials I want to use and what I want the surface to look like and which colors to concentrate on. So I sort of narrow those sort of things down, and then um, gather the materials and a work surface and everything, and then just really go at it intuitively. Um, so I guess I should have added that, it's making smaller sketches and um, practicing before going pretty big, because my work is usually like 5 feet wide or tall, uh, maybe by 4 feet. So yeah. And then as far as my background goes, yeah, um, it does play a part. I mean, I don't have any certain heritage that plays a part, as a white male. There's not a lot of I don't know. Um, but anyway, so European descent, that kind of thing. But um, my upbringing and, well, what I decided, when I was working on the last series of paintings, is that I wanted to address sort of this, being from parents that got divorced when I was like a year old, basically, um, and in the 80s, and when that wasn't necessarily common, and um, feeling, um, as an adult, coming to terms with that. While I had a stable home and my mom worked really hard to provide that, um, that just feeling of instability or just different things. And so my work um, talks about the um, precariousness of home, um, and the unsettling feeling of not being uh, at home or having a place, a permanent residence, that kind of thing. Um, and then also, as a child, looking towards this idealized home where in magazines that my grandma had stacks and stacks of these interior design magazines, and would sit as like a 6 and 7 year old and sort of um, daydream about this house and that room and this furniture and this art and these antiques, and this garden. And then it just snowballed into an adult, just sort of being obsessed with having this like perfect looking home, and um, a garden, and having this idealized life, and sort of realizing that maybe other gay men are drawn to that same thing, and um, is anyway, so exploring all of that, those notions in my work, and in an abstract way, um, in a yeah.
I'm going to interject because I think what you're saying is very relative to my life. So my upbringing from up to age, I think 10, was interesting in the fact that I had during that stage you're developing friendships and things like that. You're meeting new families, and much like you said, my parents divorced around that 10, 11 years old, age time for me. And I remember, always seeing these commercials or going to friends' houses, whichever, and witnessing these sort of, nuclear families, or these like, idealized families, and kind of being a little confused, because it's like, well, we don't eat at the dinner table every night, or my we don't have game night. There are these family interactions that are in media are led to be normal. I just didn't have, and we didn't experience. And I remember, even at that age, realizing that something wasn't normal, something wasn't right, regardless of how much you wanted to believe that the relationship that my parents had was perfect. And I remember when so I have an older brother who's about a year or so older, and I remember when we were sat down to kind of, we were told that they were getting a divorce, and the situation was odd. And I don't know if this was sort of an intuitive thing that happened, or it was planned out and it just went really wrong. But my brother and I were taken to my parents' room, and it was just my dad, and the door was shut, and I could hear my mom like outside of the door. So telling us this stuff, and then I could hear my mom kind of interjecting from the outside, almost as if accusing my father of not being 100% honest and things like that. And so just this chaotic mess. And I think that has to play a significant role. I don't want to say that that's what led me to confirm my identity or whatever, but I think that played a huge part in this sort of self-discovery at a later age, of realizing that this sort of normality doesn't always exist, that it's actually normal to not be normal, and to realize the differences that I had, even though they may not have any direct correlation with my parents' relationships, but to realize that lack of normality, and to sort of find comfort in the fact that I can live this life that is not sort of the status quo within pop culture, and pursue it and be happy and be healthy and whichever. And I think you had mentioned your work is relatively abstract, and it's interesting because it's like does the idea of abstraction and comparing that to our very similar upbringings, is there a parallel between the two? Is family an abstract concept when it's led to be taught as it's a very simple idea, and sort of I use the word chaotic, and then oftentimes abstract things can be very chaotic, and I think that it's just an interesting kind of sort of rabbit hole of a conversation to go down into. So I think it's very interesting that it seems like you and I had shared very similar upbringings, although you kind of experienced that at a, you know, at a different age or a different point in your life and a different just time in general than what I did. I think, you know, mine would have been like early 2000s. So I'm sure divorce was more prevalent than in the 80s. So understanding that idea of a taboo and sort of the effect, the after effect that it would have on your family, on your parents or whichever. So I think that's, I could see that how that would be playing a part in your artwork and using that as sort of an inspiration. So my next question is, what, when you create, and then after this we'll move into the more queer centric questions, but when you create, what is sort of the result, the goal, the outcome of a piece of work? You know, do you go into it, you mentioned intuitively, but is there still I can't speak today, is there still some sort of product that you kind of hope to get in the end? And then how do you hope to use that product? Is it to convey a message? Is it to, you know, be concealed in a room somewhere? You know, kind of what's the end, the result of your creative process in the products that you make?
Yeah. So as an artist and as like a sort of recent student, it's, you think of your art in a gallery and or in someone's home, and then you know, I've had some professors like challenge me with that and think, does your art have to be permanent? I don't know, it's kind of art philosophy in a way of like, is, you know, and thinking about the art market and art as a product and to be sold and possibly to go up in value. So there's all these sort of things going on that you consciously think about or unconsciously. But also it's this super personal thing, you know, where I'm talking about my childhood or my like not feeling good enough in this aspect or that aspect, and it's like weird to have that on display for complete strangers to see. And so there is a part of it where you want to keep that hidden, this conflict. So but then there's also like, well, if I don't expose that part of myself and I don't challenge myself to explore painful things, is my art good? Is it relevant? Will it challenge a viewer? Will it make them feel something? So there's all of these things at play that it's hard to pinpoint, like, I want this message to come out, especially when there's an abstract work and it's there's not like a specific visual or representation in mind. You want a viewer to interpret it however they want, but then you're also kind of expected to explain your work and possibly have like a detail card or a little bit of an essay about the work. So there's again a conflict of how much to explain and how much to expose. So yeah, there's different things that one considers So for me specifically, I want the viewer to get a sense of chaos um, and instability. Like, is this painting about to fall off the wall? Is it structurally sound? And what do these lines mean? Or just a little bit of confusion. Um, so yeah, those are the sort of main kind of points for my recent work, and um, I would hope that, again, just based on the history of the art market, that my a gallerist says, I want to do a show, or I want to include you in a show, and I'm going to invite people, I'm going to invite buyers and things like that. So um, that's it's hard as an artist, like, to um, want to be successful as an artist. There's the financial side, but there's also the, like, um, a critic, or an audience, or to be able to show in different parts of the country, or maybe I'm trying to get into a residency, um, and um, I don't know. So there's a lot of different avenues, but that's hopefully answers your question.
Yeah. Well, I think what stuck out from what you said, and it actually caused me to kind of begin this trail of thought that I never really kind of considered. So, my education, the school that I went to was a private Baptist rural university, so we were sort of led to believe that the value of art lies in sort of the classical tradition, and I think that also can be said for the product itself. And you had mentioned sort of the idea of whether or not we can decide if our result of our creative process is permanent or not. And I think that is a very powerful sort of statement to say, and I kind of wish somebody had told me that years ago, because I think the biggest inner struggle was, I had this idea, it's thoroughly thought out, I'm going to put this to work, I'm going to create it, but then it's like, but what do I do with it? What happens to it? And sort of this disappointment when, if you show it, if you don't show it, maybe the success of it doesn't go as far as you wish it would. And you sort of, either destroy it or reinvent it, or whichever. And that sort of almost guilt of feeling like, I guess I didn't have a clear, intention for this piece, but now that I'm finished with it, it's done and over, it's lost in time and stuff. But I think, considering that, we have that choice to decide what is permanent, what is not, and then to say that, I know, like, a lot of installation work, for example, I think kind of falls within this, especially if it's site specific, you produce and you show it or whatever, and then to feel confident in your decision to say, like, it has served its purpose, maybe you've documented it or whichever, and it's okay that it's not a permanent thing. And I think, I don't know, I just, when you said that, it was extremely just kind of catching to me, because I've always just, again, in that classic tradition of art being made generally for monetary compensation, but then being sort of idolized or in some cultures worshipped and protected, and passed down generations. It's got to withstand sort of the test of time, and there's a lot of pressure that I think goes into artists and their work, of, like, much like a writer creating the next American novel. Is this piece, if you have that intention of being recognized? You know, is this piece going to be that piece that people study and things like that? Which isn't to say that's everybody's, you know, challenge or whatever. But again, just my education, just that was sort of what was ingrained in our head was, you know, develop a skill and then utilize that skill in producing work that is permanent. So I appreciate you mentioning sort of just that phrase alone, just for my own personal gain, moving forward in my creative process. And you know, I think too that's also kind of hindered my process because, again, I feel like, well, I don't want to create something with the intention of it being permanent and not knowing the longevity of it, the life of it, and so I'd rather not make anything without an end goal and stuff. So next question. I kind of want to again jump into these queer centric. Now that we know who you are, kind of your process, I kind of want to start intersecting your identity as gay and using sort of that message in my research and going forward. So really quickly, in your own words, you know, what exactly is queer art, or, you know, what can be considered a queer art, and can anybody emulate that art, or do you have to specifically identify as queer to be a part of sort of that genre, so to speak?
Well, I think that, in my opinion, that queer art expresses, you know, the conflict between what is, you know, mainstream and anti-mainstream or outside of that, and it can represent a sexual thing or sexuality, but it can also be, you know, a feeling or a philosophy, some kind of political activism. So, you know, there's a lot that can be represented there, and there's all kinds of different mediums. So the question about, you know, who can emulate that, and do you have to identify as queer? And I think no. That's kind of my first reaction, is that there you can have a person can maybe have a super close relationship with someone who is queer, and have been affected so much that it, you know, you create a piece of art that expresses, you know, maybe that person or that relationship, or that feeling, because I think that everyone at some point has felt different and felt maybe alienated or ostracized, and can use that experience to do it, you know, to create work. But I can also see that there, you know, the other side of it, the argument of where, you know, you need to identify as this to be included in our, you know, to sit at our table. So there's, you know, people that I know that maybe they, and that everyone knows that or has heard of, that, you know, didn't identify as queer until they were 60 years old, because of that, you know, mainstream focus on normality and passing, and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a hard question to answer, and it's like my answer may change in 10 years after a certain experience or um, things like that. But I think that for me, what binds me to other queer folk is um, a feeling of that ostracization as a child, learning resiliency or how to um, fight back in a way, not necessarily physically, but um, through my actions or how I kind of speak or things like that. Um, just surviving childhood or surviving bullies or things like that. But then there's plenty of queer people that that it wasn't their um, experience, and are they then excluded from this club that I've kind of created in my head of people that have survived the straight patriarchy. So uh, it's I think that we all could use more education into what is the queer experience, um, and what are the definitions or what are the theories about the definitions. Because a lot of it, in academia, you see queer theory, so there is no finite laws about queer identity. It's theory, and yeah, I guess that will be my answer.
Yeah. Okay. So looking into sort of that queer experience kind of actually is a great segue into this next question. So how does queer art, well, let's just say art in general, but we can emphasize queer art, how can that, whether it's, historical examples, present, or ones in the future, giving advice to, how does that help translate? And I use the word diligence of queer activism and queer culture, but you had mentioned the queer experience, and I kind of like that better. So how does art, help sort of translate the queer experience? And what sort of value does queer art have in moving forward, and whether it is causing change, or you mentioned education, does it have an educational value for people who identify as queer, identify as straight, or just somebody, who happened to come upon queer art and is taking something away from it? So does it have sort of the power that we think, all art has in translating a message? Does queer art specifically hold any value in conveying the queer experience in hopes of providing education, or in hopes of maybe sparking change, if that makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's see. It's almost like, does queer art have value? And of course, I would say yes. And when you are, well, okay, for me, before I even knew that I was gay, or what the word gay meant, or even heard of the word, again, at my grandmother's, she had a big kind of art library, and a series of books. There was like a book on Michelangelo and Raphael, and I want to say like all the Ninja Turtles, but
yeah.
anyway, so these kind of masters, and of course there was like nude sculptures and like um, soldiers and that kind, muscular men, and as like an maybe 7 or 8 year old, it's kind of like it definitely sparked. So for me, just the um, visual of being gay, being attracted to men, um, that was I first identified through art, and then definitely wasn't any kind of explanation, or I had to figure it out myself, um, and that art wasn't queer art. I mean, it was
Mhm.
created um, during the Renaissance, and perhaps some of the artists were queer artists, where they were
Mhm.
gay, or they had wives, but also male lovers.
Yeah.
So and of course, any of that information would not have been put in that book in my
Mhm.
grandmother's library. So um, there's all of these um, weird nuances and hidden things, and so to go into or to open up an art book, or to go into an art gallery and say, this is queer art, and this um, it's it's a different feeling, and for someone who's young and experiencing life in a new way, even if it's a someone who doesn't identify as queer, to be able to see another perspective is important. And um, a lot can be said. We all read about, as children, different cultures and different perspectives. So totally relevant to learn about that. And um,
Well, sort of touching on what you were talking about, this, idea of classical art, such as, Michelangelo, these sculptures, and what I think is kind of frustrating but interesting at the same time is, we idolize these almost symbols of eroticism. I mean, I'm not to say like the Statue of David is erotic, but this fascination with this sculptural, idealistic human body, whether it's the male or the female, um, especially within a religious sector, and sort of being accepting of that type of imagery, but then moving into a contemporary sense with queer art, where I know not all queer art is sexual necessarily, but I feel like there is a lot of sexual energy in queer art. And can we say that we're referencing a more traditional, widely accepted approach of art within queer art, but yet at the same time, queer art is generally, I'm sure by a wide margin of people, is looked down upon. I remember when I first learned about Mapplethorpe and his imagery, and just kind of just being blown away by the a level of eroticism that was in his work. And but kind of also thinking, well, yeah, there's these tools and technologies that are used in his work to sort of enhance that shock factor almost, but I still feel like it's very comparable to how we visualize, work of our predecessors, that I don't know, I guess for me it's just like when we incorporate physical, obviously gender specific imagery in our artwork, depending on the context, or in our case, if we label it queer art, it sort of gets a whole different meaning. And I think that people, again, depending on context, people think of sexual identity as something, you know, in queer culture, it's a lot of the outsider opinions think that, you know, that sexual identity is like bondage, or, you know, it's a pleasure thing or whatever. But when we think of sexual identity in sort of like a religious realm, or maybe even secular, I'm not for sure, it's sort of just a part of nature. It's ritualistic, like whatever, and it's okay to produce it and stuff. So um, I think and it kind of leads me into the thought that, you know, can art be interpreted unintentionally as being queer art? You know, can you look at Michelangelo's statues and your response be like, wow, I could, although that may not have been his intentions, I don't really know, but could that be, you know, considered one of the first elements of queer art? You know, I get the mindset of showing these, you know, whether it's biblical and mythological beings, but depicting them nude, depicting them, you know, sculpted, this sort of presence, you know, is there a similarity that can be found in contemporary queer art, in terms of presenting a body in such a manner and stuff? So I'm again rabbit trailing here. My mind kind of goes off on these different directions. So I am enjoying this conversation because you're bringing things to light that I think I've never considered before, but I think are very sort of proactive in this conversation and in the research that will follow. So I kind of, you know, derailing just a little bit here, going back to sort of just queer experience, and I'm going to keep that because I kind of like, I always use the word culture in a lot of things, but I think experience is even more of sort of an umbrella term than maybe culture would be. But and this is sort of, again, starting to target, you know, age specific audience. So an adult, you know, your response to an adult audience might be different to a youth audience. But when communicating to someone, maybe you're a grandparent, who has expressed either opposition towards the queer experience, or simply has little experience with queer people in general, what elements of that experience, in your opinion, do you think are important to highlight and or discuss with these people in the hopes of providing a positive insight and education about the queer experience?
I would say that to highlight, you know, just like the personal struggle, because I think that everyone relates to conflict and kind of the moral struggle, what to do, and but also you know, that, like I was saying, the bullying or the you know, some are kicked out, and so highlighting that, but also I don't have, you know, the perfect answer, but I would say that, you know, part of me is like, oh well, hide the sexual talk, like don't talk about that. But I think that, you know, research is important, and sexuality everyone experiences. So you know, to me, I think of the Kinsey scale and saying that that there's all of these like gray areas that whereas, you know, we think of the world as gay, lesbian, you know, LGBTQIA, and but we, within that section off, compartmentalize different things. But, you know, on the Kinsey scale, it was questions like, have you ever had sex with the same sex, or have you ever kissed or done this kind of physical activity, or even thought about that this kind of physical activity, and you may be placed as a 2 instead of a 0 because you had thought about it, or yeah. So I think that the bisexual community is a lot wider than we're willing to, Americans maybe are willing to admit, out of fear. And um, so I think bringing up those kinds of things is that um, you may experience same-sex attraction, um, but you may not identify as a gay or a lesbian person, or you may right now identify as a male or female, but in 10 years that may change, or thinking of um, what would you do, like kind of posing a question like, if your brother or sister told you that they were trans, or that they were asexual, or this whole array of sexual identities, all within the kind of queer um, sexual identity. So I feel like there's a lot of researchers out there who could better answer the question, but in my experience, like that's like people grasp onto personal stories and um, sort of conflict or moral questioning, and that would be a good kind of segue to go into it.
Yeah, well, and I agree. I think, queer people are sort of labeled as being a part of this sort of spectrum. And I think for a lot of people who maybe don't understand that that spectrum, it could be overwhelming and maybe and often probably really confusing, especially when talking about, you know, educating them on like the different types of identification, whether you're bisexual, what does that mean? And, can you be this and this? Um, and I think again, going back to that idea of family and sort of normality, people who exist within those environments, who maybe are conservative, or educated by their parents and believed by them. I could see where that sort of abstraction, which in my opinion is the queer spectrum, it is a very abstract sort of concept, and I don't think it can be easily explained. I could see them, that being chaotic to them and hard to understand. So, that is a very loaded question for me to ask, because again, there's not just one or a handful of things that need to be discussed. I guess two, it would need to be considered the individual, what they already know, what they don't know, and then kind of dividing it into there when going into that question. But this is my final question. Just simply, what advice could you give? And you can use your personal experience, you can use maybe the experience of somebody else that you know. But what advice might you give to a young queer kid, who maybe is possibly closeted, so maybe they have yet to identify as a queer kid, who wishes to live their truest self, but is afraid of the consequences? And where might they start in terms of recognizing and acknowledging their identity? Typically we go to a certain source, so that could be a parent, a teacher, a queer friend, etc. So what advice could you give to somebody who's in fear of those consequences, and where might they start in sort of building the foundation of their identity, and coming forth with that identity publicly, I suppose you could say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's hard to say, go to find a trusting adult or whatever, because you you're so unsure and you don't want your secret out. And um I did not have an adult, even though I had plenty of um great people in my life. It was just kind of like, well, this is something that I'm gonna um hold on to, and I cannot let anyone know.
Mm-hmm.
um I had, the internet, and had, um at the time in the 90s, it was like AOL chat
Mm-hmm.
room, and um, male for male chat rooms. And
Mm-hmm.
so there was sexual stuff that was discussed, but there was also like cultural, like, what do you do? How do you navigate this and that? Um, and then um, I also found that, I grew up in Louisville, and there was they called it Louisville Youth Group, super nondescript, but
Mm-hmm.
um, that met, it was like a queer LGBT youth group that met on Frankfurt Avenue. And so I went one time. I lied and said I was going to a football game,
Mm-hmm.
and went. And I mean, I, definitely had like preconceived notions of what it would be like. And then it didn't really meet those expectations.
Mm-hmm.
But it was there, and it was a safe place. And people were talking about relationships and honesty. And um, there was like adult leaders um, who were kind of guiding the conversation and sharing their experience, and um, offering a safe place. And um, so I think, maybe look in your community. I found that in the Leo weekly kind of newspaper, and the sort of calendar of events. So use those community resources. And I kind of am wary to be like, you know, look online for online communities, because there's a lot of bad things on the internet that I wouldn't want children exposed to. So um, maybe there's what I'm sure that there's probably websites dedicated to, like, it gets better, or gay youth um, topics, things like that. So hopefully that exists. And um, I think that the arts are an incredible resource for finding acceptance, whether it's um, you know in art class, talking to your art teacher, the theater. I feel like the theater is such a um, I wasn't involved in theater, but I know that other folks just, that was their true passion and still is. Um, and it's, such a community of acceptance. And um, so I think, music is probably a similar avenue, and
Mm-hmm.
not as sort of queer identity identifying as we would stereotype theater to be, but just any kind of arts. And um, just do what you enjoy. Um, and hopefully that'll lead to a place where you can, be accepted. I did kind of come out in high school to just my parents, and or my mom and stepdad, and I did get some pushback from them. And I was able to say, um, to my mom, who was like talking about, the religious stuff, and how she felt like she failed, and I was able to say, you raised me in a way to think highly of myself and to expect other people to respect me. And you raised me to not let anyone speak to me in such a way that you're speaking to me now. So um, I guess dig deep, to kids, to dig deep and to know your worth, and that you are worthy, and that not everyone will see that, but um, be your own kind of champion. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think in addition to sort of acknowledging, and I think, as you know, that especially if you are a youth, and I would imagine that there are similarities in terms of these consequences, even as an adult, they just may present themselves differently. But is to understand that, you know, obviously it's a very fragile period of your time when you decide, when you're kind of boiling to the point to where you want to finally open up and discuss this. But to understand that, it's almost like a, I don't know how to put, like a sacrifice, realizing that, like you had said, that not everybody is going to be okay with that. And are you okay with respecting that decision and still moving forward? And I think, for me, I sort of, and I hate the question when people are like, when was the moment that you realized? Because I think there's much more than that. But the moment that I realized that, like, I wanted to communicate this, I sort of internally had this conversation with myself, and I made this list. I was like, okay, here are the people. It was very limited because I didn't want to like overwhelm myself, but I like three people. Here are the top three people whose opinions matter to me, but also carry the most weight in terms of, what do these consequences look like? Like, what would be sort of the fire trail afterwards, and how do I react to that? And anybody else that didn't fall within those three people, um, I was okay with that sacrifice of ruining a friendship, or being a displaced member of family, because I knew that as long as I had the support of these three people at that time in my life, I could still move forward, happy, healthy, and whatever. And these three people were also people that I already kind of felt like I could safely communicate to. So again, that's going to be different for somebody who's in a situation where, their top three people, their top most influential people, might also not be a safe thing. So I can't really, provide a universal solution. But just speaking on my experience, having that conversation with myself and identifying who is most influential to me, and then who am I willing to potentially sacrifice to stand my ground in terms of my worth, um, was sort of was extremely pivotal in my life. And I remember one by one, you know, having these private conversations with these people. And lucky enough for me, all three of them were super accepting. And then from there on, it didn't matter. And one of those people, unfortunately, was not my father. And to this day, I mean, I came out when I was, I think, 17, and I'm 26 now. It's almost 10 years. Um, I've never had that conversation with my father. It's just left up to presumption that he's aware and he knows, but I'm okay with that. I'm okay. I don't feel like I have to have that conversation. Well, I don't feel pressured to have that conversation. That's just how it is. But yeah, I think the one thing that you mentioned that is extremely important as a takeaway is recognizing your worth, and then being okay with potentially having to make these sacrifices within your immediate family or group there. So, but yeah, well, David, I really appreciate your time. I know we are like an hour into this on the dot, so I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. It has been a very long time since I've been able to talk art or theory or whatever. My bubble is so small. I'm actually in my house right now by myself, so if that tells you how small it is. So I really appreciate you being so willing to sort of help me out with this interview, and I'm excited to share this information with my classmates. I think although it's an online environment, so I've never met these people. I don't know kind of what their lives are like, but I'm proud to be able to advertise this conversation and hopefully, present it to somebody who's going to take something away from it positively. Or if not, then open that door to a conversation and getting down to the nitty gritty of why they believe the way they believe and stuff. So I won't take up any more of your time. Again, I really appreciate it. I look forward to hopefully communicating with you more in the future. So don't be a stranger. I'm a safe place. I tell all my friends that. So ever need anything, let me know for sure.
Yeah, I'm happy to help.
Yeah.
Good luck on the project.
Yes, thank you so much. My next interview is Spencer, which I'm sure you know Spencer from Queer Kentucky. I of course worked
We
with
were
him.
roommates for
Oh, you really?
We were, yeah.
Oh my God, that's so cool. I know I reached out to him first because obviously I've worked with Spencer, and I idolize his contribution to Louisville's queer community and Kentucky's queer community and stuff. And so I was like, I need his, input in this conversation and stuff. And then I was like, well, I need a queer artist too. And I was like, well, the only person that I would have access to, that I would know, was you. And so, and I always try and follow anytime you post work and stuff. So when you agreed to do this, I was like, oh my God, thank God. Somebody out there is so willing to help me and spread this conversation. Well, tell Spencer I said hello, and I will talk to him soon.
All right, tell him I said hello.
All right, awesome. All right, well, thank you so much, David. I'll talk to you later.